buy a football.
Buy football.
Exactly.
Well,
So there just
that-
wasn't a lot
that's-
of things, and
oh,
you're talking about the Depression era, so things were
that's
really
right.
rough.
Well, and the whole world is opened up with communication. I'm going to get me a drink.
Okay.
How about you?
That's fine.
Yeah.
There we go. All right.
The weekend of retreat where I met John and had my first taste of the student volunteer movement activities and all, opened up a whole new. I became a member of the national council of it and used to go. I went to New York a couple of times a year to board meetings and things of that sort, and so it really was a very creative, helpful thing. Now, I
That's
remember
great.
my mother came to America on furlough. She was in America on my senior year. Up to then, I hadn't seen them for 3 or 4 years, you see. And I went to the telephone to make a reservation for a flight, not a flight, but a train trip to New York, to a meeting. When I hung up, she said, well, it'd be nice if you'd tell me what you were planning to do. And I said, you know, Mother, I've never had you here, and I never crossed my mind to say anything to you about the fact that I was going to New York. So you learn you have to manage yourself.
Yeah, but
I was very faithful about writing a letter every single week.
that's wonderful.
And of course, it took nearly a month to get there, and a month to get an answer back. But what you can do is what you can do, and you accept that, and you don't know what it would be like if it was different.
That's right. You were pretty brave and independent, so pretty, I would suspect, atypical for young females, American females at that time.
I have no idea.
Sure
about
sounds
that.
like it.
Yeah, but I just and you know, we travel by bus and I never took a plane trip. It's all bus travel. In fact, after my senior year, I spent a whole year traveling around the country just like John had done, visiting campuses in the interest of the student volunteer movement. And there were groups on all these campuses where you'll contact people. And I'd get up and make chapel talks to 1,000 people. You know, I think about it now, I think, gosh, I was a big fool.
That's amazing. So was it religiously oriented?
Oh, yeah.
And was it
It
denominational?
was oriented, no, not towards denomination. It was oriented towards a vision of the world and the mission of the Christian faith to the world.
That's great.
And information, and there were an annual conference in each state,
That's great.
and there would be we were in the South Atlantic region. I traveled in North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. Those were the 5 states that I traveled in.
What's become of the organization? Do you have any idea?
It was in the early, let me just get my centuries right, my years. In the early 50s or 60s, it melded with the YMCA,
Oh, really?
and I think it grew out of that in the first place, probably, you know.
Very
It was a sort of a
interesting.
particular focus of student activity, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about John, and let's take him up to the marriage. Where was he born?
John was born in Lincolnton, North Carolina, where his father was pastor of the church there.
Interesting. When was he born?
In 1909.
That's
Yeah,
great.
the year before I was.
Do you remember the birth date?
Yeah, February the 9th. Yeah. And his family came to Austin when he was 6 years old. And his father was pastor of Central Presbyterian Church
Amazing.
downtown, called First Southern then,
Yes.
for 25 years.
That's amazing. So where did they live in Austin?
They lived on West Avenue, 1711 West Avenue.
Is the house still there?
I don't think so, no. And he finished college here, and then went to seminary here for 1 year, and then went to Yale to finish up. And that was because there was a very world-renowned writer, a professor at Yale, about China and about the church in China. And so he was already turned towards China then. Before I even met him, he was already interested in that. So I can't claim any credit for that part. No. But he had I think, a very, very good life here in Austin,
So he went to UT.
He went to UT.
What did he study there?
I think he majored in English.
That's great.
And probably maybe that's the best thing for somebody that's going to be speaking. And I don't know, I hadn't thought about that much, but I think English was his major, yeah.
And then he went to
And then he went to Yale.
Then he went to the Presbyterian Seminary?
Went to the seminary here for 1 year.
For 1 year?
And then transferred to Yale.
Was the seminary where it is now?
Yeah, that's right. It didn't start there. It started down on Red River or Cesar Chavez, I've forgotten, but down in that part of Austin, I think. But when he went there, it was up where it is now. Parts of those buildings were there then, yeah. So he was very active in the YMCA. That was, and the student volunteer group on the campus too. Almost every school of any sort at that period would have a group that maybe was tied to the Y or the YW on the campus, you know.
Yeah. So when were you married?
We were married in September of 1934.
That's great.
Yeah.
What, you recall the number of the day?
Oh, yeah,
September?
the 4th of September.
The 4th of September?
The 7th of September. 4th is my birthday, the 7th of September, yeah.
And where were you married?
And we were married in Macon, Georgia, where my relatives were. My parents were in China. My youngest sister was here in college, and she was there at the wedding, but the rest of it was family connection there in Georgia. Right. And then we went on back to Yale for that year after our marriage. So we were married there. And the first year, John developed a terrible sinus condition, partly exacerbated by working as an extra at the postal service during Christmas to earn some money. And the doctor said, I think the only thing for you to do is just to leave this weather up here, go to Florida and sit in the sun. So after we'd been married about 5 months, that's what happened. And boy, did I feel sorry for myself. And he packed a suitcase and started off on the bus.
Wow. For
Florida. And he had a sister, a woman who was a minister's wife, who was his sister's good friend. So he went to them, and they put a cot on the back porch and said, you've got to see our doctor, our ear, nose, and throat doctor. He's a man from Arabia, sent here by missionaries, Dr. Sad, and he's a wonderful surgeon. And before the whole thing was over, why, John had surgery on his nose, opened up his sinuses, and started him on the back road to health then.
That's good.
And I stayed on at Yale and moved in with another classmate, and heated our lunch on a little electric plate and ate at night at the munitions factory.
Amazing.
Cafeteria.
Why?
Walked back and forth, didn't have a car.
Why did you eat there?
Place where you could get a cheap meal.
Oh, that's a good reason.
And it was close enough to the divinity school to where we could walk from there back home. See, we didn't have any transportation except our legs.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So
when did you leave New Haven?
I left New Haven the day of my exams were over. I didn't even stay for my graduate degree, diploma. In June of 1935.
So where did you go from there?
I went from there to Austin, where John was at that time, and then he was called to Uvalde Presbyterian Church out in West Texas, and we were there for 2.5 years before the church could afford to send us to China because they were so poor. And it was only when somebody got sick or died that you could replace someone. So
that's interesting.
In 1937 that happened, and Fred was 3 months old then, our first child.
So he was born in Uvalde?
He was born in Uvalde. And David, the middle one, was born in China, and the third one was born in Taft. Amazing. And then went back as babies. So they all had their babyhoods in China.
And what's the name of the third one?
The third one is really Jack or John. He's finding Fred, David, and John. Fred was named for my father.
That's great.
Yeah.
So tell me about your return to China. So you had been gone
I'd been gone for over 10 years. Yeah, and of course things had changed a lot. There was a bus ride to my,
Wow.
instead of the train, instead of the boat, for instance. Terribly rough and but a bus ride. We didn't rent a car of any sort, but got to my parents' home that way, and I've got pictures of being there with this 3 months old baby. And
it had changed a lot, at least politically.
oh yes, it was actually, you see, the Japanese were gone, and the communists were gaining in power, and the war was moving fast that way. Yeah, 37. No, actually, I beg your pardon. The Japanese hadn't come yet. We got there in April, and the Japanese got there in July. And the first thing that we were up at this resort studying Chinese, and when the things broke open, and my father said, well, I think it'd be safer for you all to come to Huchow, which is off the beaten track, than to try to get back to Suchow where you were, and see what's going to happen, because the Chinese were not prepared for the Japanese. So we packed up and went down to Huchow, to my parents' home, and I stayed there, and the church in Shanghai communicated and asked John if he would come and serve there while he couldn't be in his own station, which was, so he had gone to see about that, and he came back expecting to have some time to get his papers and his books together and all, and my father came home and said, well, they bombed Nanjing, which is 20 miles away. You all are going to have to leave in the morning.
Wow. Oops.
Bang. Yeah, the light's on.
Yeah.
So, actually, we had already, oh goodness, I'm ahead of myself. A week before that, the wounded people from the Battle of Shanghai had come in on barges to the hospital. And I'll never forget that, because as they took them off the barge and brought them to the church, to the hospital, the doctor would look and see if there was any chance of saving the person's life. If it was, they went into the hospital someplace. Sometimes right straight to the operating room. No chance to do any kind of pre-stuff, And then the others were just left to die on the grass. Terrible. And that event, and after it was passed, made my father realize that things were really, he didn't know what was going to happen. He had a hospital full of Chinese wounded soldiers, which would have become prisoners of war if the communists had gotten there, the Japanese had gotten there. And he saw it coming that they were going to. So he said, as I said that night, he came home, he said, you're all going to have to leave in the morning. And there's a man here from the Salt Gabelle that has a station wagon that they'll let you borrow to drive to. You can't go to Shanghai, you've got to go down the coast and catch a boat up to Shanghai because of the battle.
That's amazing.
So he got in the car with me and with John and Fred, who was 6 months old then. And we drove down and entered Hangzhou in the midst of just a bombing had just taken place, and got to the coast just as this boat was about to pull out. In fact, they'd taken up the gangplank, and my father shouted up at them, asked them, would they take these people? And they said, yeah, they would. And so they backed up again and put the gangplank down, and we got on board. And we got on board, and my father yelled and said, do you have any money? And I said, yeah, I've got some. And of course, we went to friends in Shanghai, and they let us, the officers let us stay in their cabin. And we came up the coast to Shanghai.
Wow.
And were there for a year while John served in the church there, and the war was going on, and they wouldn't let us go back to Suchow.
Amazing.
And so it was wartime, that's all. It was just a war. And they thoroughly looted all the stuff we had brought with us to use, clothing and books and stuff in Suchow, where it had been stored. So that was a clean sweep.
That's amazing. So how long did you all stay in China?
Well, we stayed in China until, that was 37. And in 1940, the State Department said, everybody that's not absolutely essential, and all women and children come home. So Fred was 3 or 4 years old, David was 13 months. So that's another day that I remember, that we went down to Shanghai and John put us on the boat. They evacuated, they sent a boat to take everybody out. And I'll never forget the feeling of just terror almost when he stood up and said, well, I've just got to get off because it's about to take off.
Wow.
And I came home with those 2 children.
Wow.
And a year later, almost to the day, the first days of December, Pearl Harbor was the 7th of December.
Mm-hmm.
John got there in about the first day of December to Palestine, Texas, where his parents were. No, to Macon, Georgia, where I was then at that time, waiting for him. So I tell you, those were war times.
Rough times.
Rough times, yeah.
So, did your how long did your parents stay in China, or did they return?
My father stayed. My father didn't come out, but his mother came, and she stayed and waited. And he then became needed by the military. He worked with the Chinese military during the war sometimes anyway, and so they asked him if he would take care of 250,000 laborers who were going to build a railroad from Burma to Kunming so they could fuel the war from the back side rather than ocean side. So he went to Washington and bought these huge amounts of supplies, and he had me, said, I want you to fix me a room made of mosquito netting that I can put a cot in. Said it ought to be 7 feet square and tall enough for me to stand up in it. And I'll use that for a tent at night, and that will protect me from malaria.
Yes.
And so that was my job, was to get that designed and put together for him. And he went there and worked with I don't know whether you ever heard of the book, God is My Co-Pilot. But
Yes, I have.
well, he was the one that gave the pilot that name on the operating table when my father was taking some shrapnel out of him. And he said, were you very frightened up there in the air? And he said, yeah, I sure was. And my father said, well, you were safe. God was your co-pilot.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm. And years later, when my father was in Macon, Georgia, in his 90s now, Scott, who was the pilot, came there telling about the book. And he said, you know, there was a man from Macon, Georgia here that was my doctor at that time. And he said, he's pretty old, so he's probably not here. My father was on the second row. My father said, I'm right here, son.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so
That's great.
He got at the time of presenting the book, my father was there in Macon, yeah.
That's great.
So it's
So your family has enjoyed longevity if your father...
My father was 99 when he died.
Wow.
Yeah, and I have an aunt on the other side who died at 101.
Wow, that's good.
So I guess that means that probably the combination may be gooder than I want it to be. But I tell you, moving out of this world is hard. We've got so many skillful ways to prolong life, and it's questionable how valuable the life is that you're prolonging. Latest person in our church, Arthur Hill, fractured his pelvis. So he's on a walker, and one niece is getting her 3rd hip, and and Ruth Brownlow's got a back that hurts her, so she can't. I mean, it's just endemic.
Yeah, it's true, but there's some good things too.
Well,
and part of them are those of us around you all. That's a nice.
Well, if we can keep any good sense about things,
I think that's
a
the
real
key.
demand to do that too.
And then when the suffering becomes so horrible.
Yeah.
So tell me what happened after you all returned to the U.S.
John was called, as I said, to Taft, and then
Yes.
from there he went to Cuero, which was during those 3 or 4 years before we were finally put out permanently in 1949. And then we came home, and we were at Cuero and then went to Sherman, Texas, where Austin College is,
Yes.
and were there for 10 years. Came back from Sherman to Houston, and started an interracial church in Houston in 1964 to 1980,
That's great.
and then took retirement
And retired here in
and
Austin.
retired here in Austin because he'd grown up here.
Yes,
you know.
to this
And I-
home.
Yeah, we didn't have any. I didn't have any locus that was as permanent as his was, so we came back and bought this house.
That's
I
great.
wondered how in the world we were going to meet the payments on our missionary salary income, but we managed.
And it was probably virtually out in the country when you
Well,
bought
it
it, huh?
wasn't. It wasn't out in the country, but it wasn't like
Yeah.
it is now.
No.
And I think that it was. The house is 50 or 60 years old, I think, something like that.
Mhm.
It's the original house on the lot.
Uh-huh.
And there's a Camille Shannon used to
Uh-huh.
ride horseback around here, she said, when
Is
she was
that
a
right?
girl.
That's amazing.
So, but there were houses all on both sides of the street here.
Uh-huh.
All these houses in this block were here when we bought this house. Yeah. So and Houston was interesting, very unusual. He was a white pastor in a black community, in a
Wow.
black, 80% black, middle class people primarily.
Interesting.
And we went there, and I thought, there's not any difference. But I discovered that culture has a lot to do with how you do things.
Yeah.
It's not value judgments. It's understanding what goes in different places in different ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I remember when the day John died, because I had been in Sunday school and was just
Uh-huh.
going to the service, and I thought then, and have since thought, I can't think of a better way to go than that. Being in a place you love, doing something that you love doing, and it was quick and painless.
And with your friends.
Exactly.
Yes, the only thing it's hard on is the person that's left.
Of course.
But even as I was sitting there, and the EMS man came and said, "Now, don't give up." He said, "We're still working." And I said, "I just want to be sure it's good for him,"
Yeah.
because I was beginning to be afraid of brain damage and things like that, But he was gone. Yeah, and he had 20 minutes before that in our house, standing right here in this room. He'd said to me, "I feel so good physically and spiritually."
Wonderful.
And we were ready to teach this class. It was about the man who'd been incarcerated in American University in Lebanon for a year in prison.
Yeah.
And 20 minutes later, he was gone.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. It is amazing. I said I'm not lucky enough to have two of them in one family.
Yeah, that was amazing.
But he was already signed. When we came here, the first thing he did was to do part-time as travel for Austin College.
Uh-huh.
And did that for 6 or 8 months, maybe a year. And he just agreed to be the moderator of the organizing church in Dripping Springs, but hadn't gone to the first meeting
Amazing.
when he died.
I'm paraphrasing because I'm sure it's not a quote, but I think I recall Margie Johnson saying that she wasn't born again because she was prenatally Presbyterian and has been Presbyterian since. Was that the case with you, do you think?
No, you see, I grew up in a Methodist church
Oh, really?
family. People said, "How does it feel being?" And I was the first person John received into the Presbyterian church
Really?
in Uvalde.
That's
Yeah, when we
great.
went there. Of course, the very first Sunday.
That's great.
I laughed and said, "Well, the only thing I see is it gives me the privilege of criticizing both."
That's great.
Yeah. The church in my high school years was not the same kind of thing that you would find in a church in America. We went to a community church in Shanghai that was we were only able to go to for Sunday, and went by bus from the dormitory, the boarding school. And I didn't have ties the way people have ties with churches here. It's very different.
Uh-huh.
So the understanding of the church was something that I grew into more. And then, of course, when we were married and came to be part of a congregation, then that changed everything. I became very, very much an advocate of church life and the community of the church as a stabilizing factor in your own life.
Exactly.
A place it's a base of people that You can't find one any better.
It's a big extended family for us.
That's right, exactly what it is, and you feel that way and you don't have any hesitation of saying, if I need them, they'll come if I ask them to.
Exactly.
It's a great treasure, and you often wonder how people manage that, have their jobs and have some contact with people they work with on the job, and then beyond that, it's just the family.
Exactly.
But there are a lot of people like that, Eli.
Yeah, I agree, and we were, so we've sort of grown
Into
to
something
it too, and
else.
it's a extremely precious thing for us, especially after Artis's illness.
Yeah, that's
That
right.
was
I can
really-
remember that day when we first heard about Artis on church. We
Yeah.
began to pray for her. You know, there was an interesting comment that apropos of all this, a group is talking about making a retreat center here where groups could have weekend gatherings or studies and so forth. And they were discussing what kind of name to give it. And one of the men in the group said, if it's the lights blinking,
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
maybe it means that the tapes are used up. We've been talking for over an hour.
Yeah, I think it is.
Well, that's enough.
Okay. I would like to do more, but some other time maybe. Let me just check. I'll take this off.
But this comment was so astonishing. Oh, you know, haven't got it straight yet, huh?
Yeah, I just want to look at the tape to see if it's